I am absolutely delighted to introduce Zoe Wyatt, a registered mental health social worker originally from Melbourne. Zoe has recently settled in Mauritius after almost 5 years in Southeast Asia, and she's currently in the midst of a cyclone with intermittent internet access.
Everyone, and welcome. Sorry for the technical difficulties starting today, but I am in the middle of a cyclone and I recorded a nice presentation yesterday to preempt difficulties. However, you seem to have only got a 1 minute recording. So here we are, and this is just an absolute testimony to Mauritian internet right now, that I am in the middle of a cyclone and the internet is rock solid. Fantastic. So welcome, and I will just jump straight in. So of course, the context of this presentation is vicarious trauma. The expression locate yourself in the picture was one that I learned in my first year of social work studies at Deakin University. And I'm going to be talking about that. I'm also going to, as it's a mental health conference, imagine that many of you are working in the field of mental health and perhaps a client facing. And as a result, a lot of us are well aware of the self-care message. So this session is sort of designed for, let's take a look at empathy. Let's look at self-care as to the why do we sometimes know it and we don't use it. And then a model that I'm really fond of, the stacking the scales, as a way of conceptualizing balance in one's life. So a bit about me. Some of you might be thinking, Mauritius? What are you doing in Mauritius? It's a great country, even in the grips of a cyclone. So I'm originally from Melbourne, and I relocated to Thailand initially about 7 years ago, where I was working as a trauma therapist. And I also spent a lot of time in Cambodia, and my final year and a half in Southeast Asia was Cambodia based, which was the host country for my doctoral research, which was in the area of trauma and resilience. So I had this incredible time of contracts in Myanmar and the human rights space and trauma therapy, and a lot of that I will be bringing into this session in terms of my lens on vicarious trauma. So let's look at locate yourself in the picture. And I'd like you all to consider this right now for you personally. What is it that has brought you into this field? And I'll talk more about that and why that's important in a moment. But in my travels, it's been impossible to distance myself sometimes from human suffering, from pain and trauma of that of my clients, and sometimes in terms of a country context. So this picture is Cambodia, and as a sideline academic, I would read all of these facts and stats about Cambodia, and I understood the gravity of the situation. I understood intergenerational trauma. But when I arrived in Cambodia, I found that a lot of women that were not my research participants were sharing with me their lived experiences of sexual abuse as children and violence, and just how normalised that is in a lot of communities. And I had to locate myself in the picture. I have been given incredible opportunities as being born a white woman into Australia. I've had access to education. I grew up in a middle-class environment, and I've had opportunities as a result of that many Cambodian women would find completely implausible in their situation. So when I start to apply a feminist educated lens to what I'm seeing, sometimes it created a real tension. Because as much as I was aware of this privilege that I have, how does one separate that when looking at a situation? And essentially entering my Deakin University studies in social work is very much around the fight for social justice. And I grew up with a feminist mother. So I had all of these things that were making me really angry. And it was so important, this process. And so for all of you considering, what is your lens on what you do and what are the components that make that up? So talking about vicarious trauma, what happens with, actually, let me start that sentence again. I had moved from Melbourne where I was working largely in the organisational wellbeing space. And when I arrived in Thailand as a primary therapist, trauma was the baseline. So all of my clients were trauma. And I worked with this incredible international clinical team, which was wonderful for my understanding of areas that I'd had no training in. For example, we had an eating disorder expert and all of these different levels, lenses, I like that word today, a different way of viewing sometimes symptoms for trauma clients. And so that was incredible for me. But I was submerged in trauma for a year and a half. And when I think about vicarious trauma, I actually think back to that time rather than my research in Cambodia. Because I remember this instance where a client had come to see me, not one of my clients, but in the treatment setting, and he wanted to exit treatment because his father was dying. And I responded to that in a very appropriate fashion, but I walked away from the conversation thinking, I don't feel anything. And I'm an empathetic person, so when you tell me something sad, I'm going to connect to that. And so for all of you that have chosen this as your profession, what are some of those potential vicarious trauma red flags? Because we are not all the same. It's not a one size fits all, but it's important for all of you that you are one recognizing when you might be edging towards vicarious trauma. And we can see there all of the different symptoms that may present that many of you will be very familiar with. We know about this. But that last point, coming back to this wonderful clinical team that I worked with in Thailand, I used to see fabulous examples of self-care and yoga and meditation and all that stuff that we know that's good for us. And then others of just lots of smoking and chocolate and different ways of essentially self-medicating what they were hearing. And I'm not saying don't eat chocolate. That's not the takeaway on that statement there. But things that we know are good for us, how do we move more into this? But first, wounded healers. I love this term. So first of all, big fan of yours. Had diagnosed mental health. People. And so within this conference and the people, I would imagine that many of us are compelled to do the work that we do as a result of our background. And this may, what's the word I'm looking for? Build empathy and be able to really connect in a very real way. However, the chances of that then perhaps causing burnout and vicarious trauma may in fact become much higher. And I've found in my experiences what I connect to doesn't necessarily mean that it resembles my background. In fact, far from it. The example that I gave you about the women of Cambodia, that I really connected with. I use the term land because I've worked with so much trauma before that in some instances, I can still connect and empathise, but it doesn't land with me. Other times I walk away and I can feel it. and I move into the anger of the injustice of it all, or I can become really sad and cry. So there's different ways in which we do empathise and connect with who we're working with, but often our baseline entry or segue into our careers is from this place, perhaps, of connecting with our clients. Of Brene Brown, from Jung to Brene Brown, owning our story. So who are you, and locate yourself in the picture. Very briefly, I wanted to share a short Cambodian story of resilience. One of the participants in my research study is also now a psychologist who works with young boys under the age of 12. And he has a great sense of humour. He's an amazing human being. And he likes to say, I had two paths in life. Because of all of the bad stuff that made me who I am today, I was presented with two distinct paths. I could either be a psychologist or I could be a gangster. And he laughs when he says that. I think it's fabulous. So we know this. I know that I'm talking to a group of people who most likely, especially through the pandemic, have been smashed with self-care strategies. Why are we not using it? So that's the question for the group, because I know I've been given a little bit of time in here. I'd like to hear from the group. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are around why is it so hard to implement. And I'm going to bring in my number one key strategy for bringing these toolboxes into a real life situation. Harvard University did, this is actually from a childhood trauma study that they did. But I love this analogy of stacking the scales. For every pebble that you put down of difficult clients and empathising and high stress and pandemic-related insecurities in the world, we need to stack the scales with those self-care tools on the previous slide. Social connection, relationships, happiness, joy, laughter, all of that beautiful stuff. And some of you might think, I'm not finding much particularly funny right now. And that's all right. We find one of those funny people. Our relationships are key. So how do we stack the scales for more overall positive outcomes? All right, and just finally, I've written a bunch of papers on my research in Cambodia. You can find me on ResearchGate, LinkedIn, and also I have a Facebook page. So I'd like to hear from all of you. Let's keep in touch after the session, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. And I'm just so pleased that the internet seems to still be rock solid in the midst of the cyclone. That's very exciting for me. So thank you. And now I'm going to send it back to the organisers do I close the slides? What would you like me to do?
Thanks very much, Zoe, and loving your resilience sitting there through that cyclone and presenting live to us. It's really fantastic, and I know everyone's really appreciated that. I'm just checking, I haven't seen yet any questions from the audience. So I just wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the stories of from Cambodia, if you wanted to expand on any of those experiences from there or even more recently.
Yes, absolutely. So my research was around resilience instead of in my field. Of course, when we study trauma, we look at post-traumatic stress disorder and so forth. And I wanted to flip that, and instead of looking at what essentially can go wrong post-trauma, is look at like a post-traumatic growth model in terms of resilience. And I became really interested in this because in my professional work in Thailand, this was an inpatient treatment setting, as I mentioned. We had clients come from all over the world. To be quite frank, treatment was expensive. So people had access to Western medical and mental health, and of course, money is not a buffer for trauma, but it just meant they had access. And I'd heard all these stories in Cambodia. I was linked with an NGO, and I did an earlier piece of research about these young people who, despite incredible odds, they had sorry, I'm looking at the comment in the chat box, it's really funny. And so despite all of this incredible start to life, had managed to emerge from that and create lives for themselves, families, access to education. I spoke to one survivor who was a really interesting guy. And actually, this is a question for the group, because I find this is where resilience researchers deviate in our thinking around resilience. So, snapshot. He was trafficked into Vietnam at a young age, and he speaks fluent Vietnamese but has limited recollection of that time, incredible level of trauma, comes back to Cambodia and lives on the streets because his grandfather died when he was 8. And that started this horrendous years of trauma for him. He had a very significant drug problem and had been picked up by an NGO but kept running away to get the drugs, as he put it. And then he said at the age of 14, he made a decision, I want a life that my grandfather would be proud of. So at 15, he taught himself how to read. He still had significant behavioural issues, almost got kicked out of school at one point. But the man that I was talking to is a doctor now studying. He's in his last year of surgery studies. He now works for another NGO that provides free health checks for children in the slums. He's covered in tattoos. He wears them like a badge of honour when he's working with young people who often have similar experiences to him. Now, he has anger management issues, and sometimes he will disappear for days and goes on a drinking binge and then comes back and refocuses his energies. My question to the group is resilient or not? Because some resilience literature would say, because of the substance abuse issues and the anger that, to be honest, may occasionally tip into violence, that he's not resilient. Whereas I belong to the path that would say, despite all of the odds, this young child has grown up to be this incredible human, but it's not without struggle. I think we need to move away from this picture perfect, bouncing back mentality, because for some of our clients that many of you might work with, what are they bouncing back to if that hasn't been there? It's not work stress. Ooh, 2 minutes to the end of the session. Anyway, something for you all to think about. And I know that I've kind of deviated. I mean, it's all in the vicarious trauma resilience space in terms of recovery. So I just think that one of the biggest things that I did learn from all of the clients that I've had over the years is it's just one step at a time, one foot in front of the other. And resilience doesn't necessarily have to look like this pretty picture perfect concept. It can be, it's a process of recovery is the way that I like to view it. And I do love the term post-traumatic growth. So if that hits with a few of you. And so thank you everyone for listening to today's presentation. I'm super excited it all worked. and thank you all so much. And perhaps we will be touching base at different times during the conference.
Thank you so much, Zoe. Some really fascinating stories there. And yeah, absolutely love your resilience in terms of bouncing back when the recording didn't work and through that hurricane. So some great reminders about the self-care toolbox. And I love that picture of, you know, balancing those scales and stacking the scales the right way. So a really good reminder for all of us. So everyone, with the session's about to end, but please do go to the meeting hub. You can always connect with Zoe there. I'm sure she would love to connect through the meeting hub. And thanks so much, Zoe. And I hope everyone enjoys the wrap up of the final session. Thanks all.
Thank you.